This episode is brought to you by my recent adventure, The Waking of Willoughby Hall. Explore a ruined ancient manor and try and loot it of all of its ancient artifacts, while not being crushed by a rampaging giant, roving bands of undead, and a rival adventuring party. Check it out in the description below. Welcome back to Questing Beast, I'm Ben. Today is the second video that we're doing looking at Kevin Crawford's Worlds Without Number. In our first video, we looked at the character creation and the basic rules of the game, but today we're going to look at the next 75% of the book, which is almost entirely world building tools. So Worlds Without Number is designed to be a sandbox open world toolkit. A lot of times this is regarded as the kind of grand epitome of being in a role-playing game where you have like this giant world. You can go in any direction. There's always going to be something there. There'll be new adventures, new characters. In reality, this is often very difficult to pull off because of the amount of work that it entails. So Kevin Crawford has spent basically his entire RPG design career creating these kinds of books to make that easy. And the results are pretty incredible. The quality is through the roof. So we're going to look at all the tools that he gives you and how he makes that easy to accomplish. So we're going to start here. He starts off by giving you a campaign setting, or at least a basic framework that you can use to build upon. And I understand why he does that, but I think, frankly, a lot of people aren't going to use it. A lot of it is pretty standard fantasy stuff. He has different fantasy kingdoms here, and a lot of these are designed specifically to have different fantasy tropes as their main theme. So if you want to have the fantasy Wild West, there's a good area for that. You want court intrigue, there's a good area for that. However, people really like making their own worlds, and because the tools for making your own is so good in this book, I feel like that's probably what people are mostly going to do. We have a brief history of his world that he lays out for you here, and some of the basic nations and features of the Gyre, which is this region of Latter Earth, as he calls it, which is a pretty great name. I like that. Each of the different nations has its own one-page layout here, describing its basic features, its population, the government, the problems, and so on. I suppose you could use this just as a foundation and then add a lot of your own world building on top of that. Section on the people and languages of this area, the religions of that area, and outsiders, which are extra dimensional, I should say, aliens or beings from beyond the stars that have at one point populated the latter Earth. Now, even if you aren't using Kevin's specific framework here, I really do like his general idea of going full dying Earth, Jack Vancian in his world building, because I think that really works well for old school adventures, especially giant open worlds, because it allows you to throw everything and the kitchen sink into your world. A bit like Numenera, which had the same idea. We have his concept of iterums, which are basically parallel universes, echoed worlds. Some of these are really small, so it's just like one room that's like split off into its own universe, all the way up to whole planets or worlds that are their own parallel universe. In fact, one of the fun little twists here that you can find if you read this is that his entire world, Latter Earth, is itself an iterum of a previous universe, and no one can figure out how to find their way back. They know this because if you travel above the atmosphere of his world, you find out that the stars are just illusions. The world is real, but there's nothing beyond that world, including there's no outer space even, really. So it's a kind of an artificial construct. Then we get into the section that probably most people are going to buy this game for. Even if you don't use the whole rest of it, you're going to be using the creating your campaign section. He goes into not only giving you tools in order to build that world, he gives you a lot of advice and ways to think about building that world, the steps that you're going to go through, the process. You're going to start by planning your scope, building your backdrop, and assigning tags to sites. His tag system is quite efficient. Zooming all the way out, you're going to be looking at the golden rule of preparation. So always ask yourself, if you're doing some world building, are you having fun? If you're having fun, keep doing it. But also, am I going to need this for the next play session? Because if you're not, you should probably focus on that just so you have the bare minimum ready for the next game. Building your backdrops, we start off with thinking about the world as a whole, along with some concrete questions that you can ask yourself. Going down into the region, same thing, and then down into the kingdom. So we're slowly zooming in on the area that the campaign is going to take place in, getting more particular and more concrete as we get further in. A lot of times you can have an entire campaign lasting years that barely goes several miles from its starting point if you have mega dungeon campaigns. So a lot of times you're not going to have to get beyond the kingdom. And you can have other regions and kingdoms just as kind of rumors and roughly sketched out. So you're not putting a lot of work into things that you're not going to need. Constructing geography, campaign map essentials. How do you think about maps? What are some major terrain features? One roll terrain feature detail. So there's a bunch of pages throughout this book that use this feature. I've seen this in a bunch of different OSR books where it's several random tables, 7 random tables, but each of them is a different die size. So you get your standard Dungeons and Dragons dice, right? A D4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and 20. You just roll that handful of dice and it gives you a bunch of different details that you can fit together. So for example, how populated is the feature? A rush of people have gone there. And then there's one notable kind of danger here. Of what use is it? A major trade route goes through it. What kind of event happened there? A rich ancient ruin was discovered there. What antagonists are common? A hostile sentient monster civilization. Optional quirk. The rulership of the feature is widely disputed. So you immediately have a lot of stuff that you can work with. Nation construction, because you're working on your kingdom, right, at this point. And we have tables for everything. Disputes with neighboring states, positive ties, current national problems, good things happening right now. Just to give you a sense of what's going on there, things that players are going to react to, things that all the other NPCs are going to be thinking about. Themes of nations, 20 different themes. What is the physical appearance of the society? What does the society value? So you can create a culture that is going to be gameable. Because if the culture is just fairly generic, players are just it's going to wash right over them. They're not going to think about it. But if they value things like conquest and the domination of others, or if they value things like humanistic reason and rational religion, or pacifism and peaceful resolution of problems, or submission to lawful authority, then you can just combine a couple of these things together, and now you have levers that players can pull. How is the society organized? How is the government organized? One roll government details. History construction. How do they originate? What crises did this place go through in its past? How did they overcome this crisis? What was great about its peak? Why did it fail at the final crisis? Just by rolling on these tables, you're going to get this fairly rich sketch that you can build off of. Lots of historical events. Building a religion. I can't go through this in too many details because there are hundreds of pages of this, but I just want to give you a sense of the scale of the toolkit that he has built for game masters. You got temples, how to make cults, location tags, rural villages, building major cities. There isn't a lot in terms of cities in going like street by street, but he gives you more tools for building a zoomed out picture of a city so that you know what's going on there and what the feel of the place is going to be like, what are the kind of people that are going to be there, what types of industry it has, and that sort of thing. If you want to really zoom in, you're probably going to have to work on that on your own. So here we get into the tag system so we can see how that works. Community tags. So what you can do when you need to flesh out any feature, this is for communities, but you'll have systems of tags for other things as well, is you can just pick usually 2 of these and then you mash them together. So for example, what is interesting about this community? It could have corrupt laws and it's also a sinking city. Or it's a guild oligarchy and also a pilgrimage site. So just by having 2 things, that's really all that you need. You get something that's unique and that's not going to be repeated somewhere else in your campaign. And then what you do is you go to these tag sections and it tells you how to make that even more fleshed out. So we have all these letters right here. These go for E stands for enemies. So it has a bunch of different enemy ideas and then some friends. I believe this one is complications and then things and then places. So what did we say before? It was a guild oligarchy. Let's go to guild oligarchy. So what are some enemies? You got some profoundly corrupt guild bosses, maybe some ambitious newcomers with brutal methods, or a ruthless leader of a guild of criminals. And what about some things there? A priceless symbolic guild regalia, or money earned by shady business practices. What's a complication there? Perhaps the guilds offer protection from a real or imagined threat, or they hate each other but only slightly less than the competition. So just by picking a couple of these, now you have seeds that you can build on. And by mashing them together with other tags, then you get these nice interconnected and conflicting features. And there's a whole bunch of these. We have courts. Courts is any interconnected group of people working together for an end. So it can be a literal court, but it could also be a clan, it could be a gang, or anything like that. Business courts, criminal courts. Each of them have tables for the people that are there, the problems that it has. Familial clans, religious courts. If you want to create cults, that's really great for that. And then court tags, same thing. Maybe your court is a combination of, how about cadet branches and ruling regalia, or perhaps that it's a hopeless rival combined with sublime skill. Whatever these things are, it's going to make it totally unique. Ruins. Ruins get the same treatment. Of course, these are basically dungeons. You want to flesh out those dungeons to make them completely distinct from each other. Each of the different sections of the world map that he's created has a random table for the kinds of dungeons that are there. Ruin tags. Let's combine two of these. Maybe they are ancient art archives combined with religious zealots. Or maybe it's a fallen sanctuary and also a lost colony. The same treatment is given to wildernesses, right? 50 different tags. Each of these things has 50 tags, and each tag has 5 categories with 3 examples. So you are never going to run out of ideas no matter how hard you try. There's interesting information here on using this game in other settings. So if you're going to be translating this into other OSR things, it mentions stuff like Labyrinth Lord, Old School Essentials, Lamentations, Osric, or BF RPG, what you're going to have to think about. It's very compatible. It's designed to be used with other adventures. He extremely encourages people to dig through TSR's and the OSR's catalog of adventures, most of which, or many of which, are free at this point, and just slap them directly into Worlds Without Number. You'll need very little, if any, modification. The section on creating adventures, so this is where you'll be taking all of these tools that we've rolled up before, all of these tags, all these features, and then weaving it together into a situation that's fun to deal with. The advice here is absolutely top tier. So this is one of the most thorough and worked out essays or guides, if you want to call it that, in the old school Renaissance on how to do this sort of thing, how to create adventures that are situations that the players deal with, rather than a path that they follow. I wouldn't say that there's a whole lot here that was completely new to me that I hadn't heard before, but it is an extremely good primer. If you have a new dungeon master who really wants to get into running role-playing games and doesn't know where to start and wants just a starting point, wants someone to walk them through the principles and the basic ideas of how you set up this sort of thing, this is the book that I would give to them. It is a little bit heavy. It's pretty in-depth, but it's thorough and it's clear. He has sections on what GMs and players need to bring to the game. How do you actually start a session? What they need to have in mind. Has a whole section on GM issues and how to handle them. These are all the typical issues that you see on Reddit or on Twitter, where people are like, I have this personal problem in my game and I don't know how to deal with it. Pretty much all of them are covered here in very straightforward and practical manner. How do you call for skill checks? How do you use social skills? That's a common problem. I have a character and they have all of these social skills. How do I balance that with what I say, right? To what extent is the outcome determined by the things that I say my character says and my acting ability, and how much is determined by the mechanics? And his solution here is a very straightforward one, which is that if what you say the character says, if that makes sense, if that would convince them, if that's just very likely, then it happens. If it's very unlikely for it to work, then it doesn't happen. However, if it's ever in an in-between state where it's not clear whether that would work or not, then you roll the dice. So that way you have both the player and the character's mechanics in play at all times. He has a number of different options for PC death and replacement. So this can go anywhere from, hey, if you die, you die, roll up a new character, all the way up to the type of game where characters don't really die and are on a mission to fulfill their destiny. And it's going to get fulfilled, even though there might be hiccups along the way. It's all about talking to your players and determining the kind of game that you want to play. And he gives you ways to do that. This section on planning and running your adventures, you could really just read the bolded text at the start of each paragraph and get a really clear idea of how to do this sort of thing. Right? For running your adventure, don't force outcomes. Have filler ready. There's lots of tools here to do that. Find out what they want to do next session. Update your world after the session. A really straightforward sequence of events here. And there's lots of rules later on here on how to update your world and keep it living and evolving. Creating combat challenges. How do you create situations that are interesting to actually play in? Combats that are dynamic and engage the players. And as always with Kevin, it's never just abstract. He gives you a whole 2-page spread of different combat challenge complications. Mix and match them, throw them together, and you'll get an interesting fight. We have a section on creating exploration challenges. Same deal here. Lots of great advice on how to establish wandering encounters, daily life, how to run different ruin sites to create lots of detail there. Framework of the inhabitation. What's going on there? What are the factions in the dungeon? Why are they there? Who are they allied with? Why are they staying there? We have lots of rooms of interest. You want to populate your dungeon with lots of different kinds of rooms, different types of inhabitants. Of course, dungeons shouldn't just be combat encounters, so you have different hazards that you can run into, enigmas, distractors, possible treasure locations to keep players exploring. We have wandering encounter tables, including things that you should think about, like what are they trying to do there? What mood are they in? So that if you run into a group of orcs for the 10th time, it's not just another group of orcs. Investigation challenges are always an interesting thing to think about. Everyone has their own opinions on how to run mysteries because they're always such a problem. Because inevitably you're going to run into these dead ends where players don't find all the clues and they get stuck. So where do you go from that point? Some people advocate just giving them more and more clues, or giving huge amounts of clues so that they are bound to find one. Or there's other games that take a tack where you're always going to find the answer if you have the right skill. The way that Kevin takes, the direction that he takes, I think is really good, which is that if they don't find all of the clues, what you can do is give them the next clue with a penalty. So this could be, for example, you're trying to track down an evil cult and trying to find the location of their base. You don't find it in time, you miss all of the clues, and as a result, their evil plan comes to fruition, or at least part of it does. And as a result, you gain more information about where that location is because there was an evil disturbance or an outbreak of tentacle beings over in the next village because you didn't get there in time. Well, now you know where they are, but you've also lost progress in a sense because people have died and the cult has grown in power. So by giving penalties, you can further along the investigation in that way. Lots of different examples of types of scenes that you're going to need to have in investigations, like resolutions, introduction scenes, hook scenes, reaction scenes, the typical things you'll need in a mystery. And it talks a little bit about rewards, renown, and experience points. So renown is like another resource that is in Worlds Without Number, which you can use to create large changes in the world. You want to affect whole towns or cities, create large projects, you're going to need to have a lot of renown before people are going to rally to you and trust you enough to get that sort of stuff done. So there's a system for that here. Experience points, there's lots of different ways that you can do experience points, and he gives you some options. The default system is that you get about 3 XP for a successful game session. And you can tweak that depending on how well they do. We can also do goal-based things, mission-based systems, or spending-based systems. So if they waste all of their treasure in between sessions in classic sword and sorcery style, then they're going to get more XP for that. Or of course, you could just slap in standard XP for gold rates from other games. Whole bunch of different tables for creating randomized treasure. Land ownership and domains. Eventually, you're going to want to build a castle. And that's how you do it. Handling wealth in your campaign, magic items, and enchanted treasures. And we get into all sorts of different types of weapons and items and how you can customize them. So with magical abilities, you can get magic swords, you can get sentient swords that talk to you, magical weapon abilities. There's like 50 of these here. You want to create Stormbringer, you got Stormbringer. Getting into magical devices, these are some standard or pre-built ones. And some advice for creating some of your own. Don't add simple problem-solving items, right? So you want items that do weird, off-kilter things that don't look like they would only work for one particular situation, so that players can find ways to use them in other situations. So that players have that problem-solving element always at the forefront of their minds. Don't add simple buff items. That, of course, is great advice. If you're giving people items that just give you +1 strength, that's really boring. And players aren't going to remember that stuff. It's not going to anchor itself in their mind, and they're not going to get creative with it. Don't add easily reusable damaging items. A section on potions here. And we start getting into our bestiary or bestiary. I always call it bestiary. I'm told that I've been pronouncing that wrong my entire life, and it's bestiary. Creatures of a far age. You can just import monsters from other OSR games, no problem. And we have this great table here, which we also find in the back of the book. So basic combat statistics for the kind of creature. So you just say, is it a human? Is it an animal? Is it a monster? You look through this table, you find roughly the thing that it fits, and you immediately get stats for it. So you don't really have to make your own stat blocks. You can just copy right what you have here. Maybe tweak it if you want, but honestly, players don't really notice if you tweak them or not, because it's mostly about how the monster looks and how it acts. So Most of the time, you can just use what you have here. Monster shapes and appearances, lots of random tables, including monstrous drives, always important so that monsters are acting differently and in unique ways, and they feel like they're motivated. They don't just want to eat things. If all the monsters just want to eat things, players are going to stop paying much attention to them. You want uncanny powers and abilities. We got randomized tables for every single one of those. One roll monstrous context. So how much local context does the monster have? Right? Do the locals react to its drive? What scars has it left there? How did the monster arise? What is its connection with the past? A twist to its activities. So this is creating a monster that just isn't a beast that wanders around. It has an almost mythic impact on the landscape. Players and NPCs' lives and the land itself is entangled with it and is tied up in the history of the place. Instinct checks is a new little mechanic that I quite like, which is that in certain circumstances, you're not going to necessarily make a morale roll, but the monster could, or the human in some cases, could default back to their standard behavior. So this could be things like the second round of combat for mobs and undisciplined fighters. It might make an instinct check. The creature has just made a morale check for any reason, so terror might cloud its thoughts and it might default back to its animal instincts. Or the enemy does something to enrage or intimidate it, or perhaps you just confuse it in some way. You're going to have little instinctive actions for different categories of creatures. So, for example, if you have beings of arrogant might and it reverts back to its instincts, that could be boast of its inevitable victory, or urge on servitors or demand surrender. Meanwhile, if it's like a combat-trained humans, their instinct could be duck and take total defense, or attack an object barrier or downed foe. So this adds a little bit of randomness to the way that the monsters fight. So already morale does that to a certain extent, right? Because they can, control can be taken out of the DM's hands. The monsters just flee if the right numbers are rolled. But this adds a little bit more randomness where they can just start acting on their own instincts and they won't act in a perfectly martial way. So by standard rules, all of the characters in this game are humans. When you're making characters, you're always making humans. But there are options here for making elves, dwarves, halflings, your standard stuff. Typically they're NPCs, but there are stats here for making them PCs. It's a foci, I believe, that you can take where you have an alternate origin, and that just allows you to slap in different fantasy races really quickly without having a whole lot of rules for them necessarily. Section on imperators, which are like sorcerer kings. Many of them are dead and have left huge scars on the landscape, but you could encounter them. They're not the people that you fight. They're more like campaign shakers. Outsiders and undead. Factions and major projects. So this is where we start getting into the faction system, which is a whole mini game that Kevin created for Stars Without Number. And basically in between sessions, you play this mini game with all of your factions. They all have their own ratings, their own stats, their own hit points. And you play this mini game to see how they interfere with one another and how they pursue their own goals. You only have to do this like once a month or so, but if you decide to use this mini game, then the world is going to feel like it's alive, because in between sessions, players will arrive at a new place and the factions have acted. They're in a new configuration. One is on top, one is struggling, or they're pushing forward with new projects. Lots of different details for factions, like the kinds of assets that they have, the force assets they might have. For example, they have scouts or temple fanatics. Maybe their cunning assets are things like expert treachery, or they have a prophet or seditionists. And these can all affect things in different ways in this little mini game. And we have a bunch of other little mini classes here. I believe that these classes, if I remember correctly, are only in the complete version of the game and they're not in the free version, but it does allow you to create some other standard D&D classes by adding these in. For example, the Invoker is a little bit like a sorcerer who uses spell points. We have a Skin Shifter who's a bit more like a druid, a duelist if you want a swashbuckler, Beastmaster, I guess that's also like a ranger or a druid. We have a Blood Priest, Thought Noble if you want psychics. And then we start getting into heroic classes and characters. So this is when you want to create characters that are much more powerful than your standard sword and sorcery people who are very human and very fleshy. They can die quickly. And so these are just optional rules if you want to run things in a more high adventure style, including legates who are basically demigods. Although, as I mentioned in the previous video, if you're going to run demigods, you probably want to get Godbound, which is Kevin Crawford's game designed specifically for that. So these are some of the superpowers that legates get, which are really powerful stuff that can completely decimate whole parties of enemies. If you're at this level, you're no longer necessarily dungeon crawling or just like fighting bandits. You're up at the level where you're traveling between planes, you're fighting demons and stuff like that. Some advice on using iterums, which are the parallel universes, creatures from other universes, fractal adventure seeds. So this is, how many? I think it's 100. It's 100 different adventure seeds that you can mix and match and combine together to create little adventures. You want your NPC generator. So you have the basic tropes that they fall under from their underclass or commoners or gentry. Maybe they're a revered artistic genius or a gap-toothed local thug or a scabby beggar, just archetypes that you can grasp onto. And then you can get more specific with things over here, including adding on their mannerisms and their appearances, their ambitions, their friendships, tragedies, romances. You can get some really fleshed out NPCs that way. So that's what you get in the world building section at the back of this. It's an incredible assortment of random tables. It's basically everything that you would need. You could read this book forever and you could mine it forever and you would never run out of possible combinations. The biggest resource here is that it just gives you more ideas than most people can think of on their own, right? Because he spent so long developing these toolkits and iterating on them over multiple books. If you're having players travel from village to village, it's often really hard to just think of, okay, how is this village different than the last one? So you just crack this book open and you now have 50 options. So everything's going to feel very distinct and alive in a way that's hard to do just on your own. So check this out in the description below. I'll have links to the free edition, which is most of this book, just lacking that section at the end with some of the bonus material. And it includes almost all the world building materials, as well as the offset edition, which is this edition right here. If that's still available, I don't know if it'll be sold out by the time you watch this, or you can get the print on demand version of the complete game. So that's it for this time. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.